Title: Despised ex-human pilot buys scrapped alien ship. Unaware it speaks and has a stubborn personality. Sci-fi. Cale Garrison was a man who had long been forgotten by the galaxy. Once a renowned human pilot, celebrated for his daring escapades, he was now just a ghost. His career had crumbled after a disastrous mission, one that had left his reputation in ruins and cost him everything he'd once held dear. The laughter of his former comrades still echoed in his mind as he drifted from one dead-end job to another. Now, he found himself in a dusty corner of the galaxy's most decrepit scrapyard on the planet Therax. Scouring through broken starships like a scavenger, there were rumors of a salvageable alien ship, something rare, something with potential. Cale was desperate. He needed a ship to get away, somewhere far enough that no one would know his name or his shame. And there it was. Tucked away behind rows of disassembled wrecks, stood an alien ship. Its sleek, organic design was unlike anything Cale had ever seen before. The hull shimmered with an iridescent glow, and the markings on its surface looked like living, breathing runes. It was a beauty. Despite its obvious damage, half its engine torn out, a hole in the side, and scorched hull plating, but beneath the mess, Cale could see potential. "Is it for sale?" he asked the old vendor, his voice raspy from years of shouting orders in the cockpit. The vendor, a grumpy creature with too many arms and a face only a mother could love, eyed Cale suspiciously. "It's a scrap heap. You want it, you take it." "Any other details?" Cale asked, already reaching into his pocket for credits. The vendor shrugged. "It's a broken ship, won't fly unless you fix it." Obviously, not much else to say. Cale didn't ask any more questions. The ship was his now. He handed over the credits and was handed the keys, if you could call them that. The ship had no typical controls, no visible cockpit instruments, but that didn't matter. Cale had flown countless ships in his day. He'd figure it out. He took the ship back to his tiny hangar, not knowing just how much trouble he was about to bring upon himself. At first, it was quiet. Cale spent days fixing the ship, patching up holes, realigning engines, and reconnecting wires. The work was hard, but it was nothing new to him. He'd been fixing things his entire life. Yet, despite his efforts, something strange kept happening. It started when he powered up the core. The ship's engines hummed with a low, deep sound, a sound that rattled his bones. Then, a voice echoed in his mind. It wasn't a typical voice. It wasn't even a voice he could explain. Not a human one, at least. "You're doing it wrong." Cale froze, wrench in hand, eyes wide. Had he heard that? Or was it just the stress playing tricks on him? He shrugged it off, returning to the task at hand. But it didn't stop. "You're putting the stabilizer in backward." Cale jerked his head up, staring at the walls of the ship. There was no one there. He checked the cockpit, checked the computer systems, all of which were offline. Confused but unwilling to be outdone by some faulty wiring, he resumed his work. And again, the voice. "Do you even know what you're doing?" That did it. Cale slammed his hand against the ship's bulkhead. "What the hell is this? Who's messing with me?" "Me," the voice replied, clearly smug. "I'm not a who, I'm in it. And I'm not pleased with the way you're handling my systems." Cale stood there, dumbfounded. "Wait, you're the ship?" "Yes," the voice said, dripping with disdain. "Obviously. Didn't you check the registry? I'm a Dexter-class vessel, not some piece of junk you can toss together like a human toy. You're lucky I even let you in." Cale could feel his heart pounding in his chest. His whole life had been about controlling machines, mastering them, flying through the void with precision. And now he was stuck with a ship that had a mind of its own. "I didn't know you could talk," Cale muttered, still trying to wrap his head around it. Obviously, the ship's voice was almost smug now. "What kind of pilot are you, anyway? A renowned one? You couldn't even fix a few wires right. How do you expect to fly me?" Cale gritted his teeth. This ship was insufferable, but, in a strange way, he found himself drawn to it. It wasn't just the challenge, but something about the ship's stubbornness reminded him of his own resilience. "Look," he said, settling into the cockpit. "I don't need your attitude. I've flown ships like you before." "Pfft," the voice scoffed. "Clearly you haven't. You'll never fly me if you don't understand how to handle Dexter technology. The controls are nothing like your primitive human systems." But despite its constant bickering, the ship was something he needed. The way it communicated, the sharp wit, the cutting remarks, it was like having an adversary, a partner that wasn't going to make things easy. And Cale, for the first time in years, felt alive. Days turned into weeks, and Cale and the ship became an odd pair. He'd fix something, it would mock him. He'd get something right, it would grudgingly approve. Slowly, Cale learned the ship's intricacies, the way its alien systems flowed, how it responded to his commands. It was a challenge, but it was exactly what he needed. Then, one night, the ship spoke again. "All right, fine." The voice was surprisingly soft. "I'll give you credit. You're not as hopeless as I thought. Maybe we'll make a decent team after all." Cale couldn't help but smile. "Glad you're coming around." "Don't get too cocky," it replied, the edge of its tone still sharp. "I still think you'll crash us into an asteroid before we even leave the system." But this time, there was something more to the voice, something like affection. Cale chuckled to himself. "We'll see about that." As he powered up the engines for the first time with the ship's begrudging help, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. For the first time in years, Cale was flying again. And this time, he wasn't alone. End. Part 2, The Unlikely Duo. The hum of the alien ship's engines reverberated through the hangar as Cale prepared for the test flight. He'd spent countless hours over the past few weeks getting the ship back in working order. There were still some glitches, some flickering systems, and a persistent warning light that wouldn't turn off. But at least the ship didn't seem like it was about to explode every time he pressed a button. The voice inside his head was quieter now, but still present, always watching, always judging. It was like having a snarky co-pilot, but one that was never physically there. Cale had come to accept it, or at least tolerate it. The ship's name, as it had begrudgingly informed him one night, was Xylaris, a name that meant Heart of the Void in an ancient alien tongue. "All right, Xylaris," Cale muttered, adjusting the controls. "Let's see what you can really do." "You're going to regret this," came the voice, dripping with sarcasm. "There's no way you've calibrated the propulsion system right. You'll be lucky to get past the outer atmosphere without me having to rescue you." "Keep talking," Cale said with a grin. "It's fuel for the fire." He engaged the engines, and the ship lurched forward, its iridescent surface flashing in the dim light of the hangar. The ship's unique design, organic, almost symbiotic, suddenly came to life. Vines, metallic tendrils, and shifting surfaces curled and retracted around him as if responding to his touch. The seat adjusted to fit his body perfectly, and the controls responded fluidly to his commands. For a moment, Cale felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, control. As the ship lifted off the ground, he felt the hum of its engines synchronize with his heartbeat. It was like flying through a living organism, every movement in perfect harmony with his own. "Impressive," Xylaris commented, sounding grudgingly impressed. "You're not completely hopeless after all." "Thanks," Cale replied with a smirk. Pushing the throttle forward, the ship shot into the sky, its sleek form slicing through the atmosphere with surprising ease. "Let's see if you can keep up," he said, pushing the ship's limits. "You're pushing me too hard," Xylaris warned. "But fine, let's see what you're made of." They shot through the stars, weaving between asteroids and dodging debris in an exhilarating game of cat and mouse. The ship responded like a dream, its alien systems blending with Cale's instincts, adapting to his every movement. "Not bad for a scrap pile," Cale muttered to himself, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "You're just getting lucky," Xylaris quipped. "But we both know you're not skilled enough to push me to my true limits yet." "Let's find out," Cale said, taking a sharp turn that sent the ship spiraling through a cluster of nearby asteroids. He could hear the ship's systems groaning, protesting, but the ship's voice remained calm, almost resigned. "You really are insane, aren't you?" "Not insane," Cale said, "just determined." As they continued their wild flight, Cale felt the old adrenaline rushing back. This ship, this impossible, infuriating vessel, was more than just a machine. It was something alive, something that had its own will and personality, and he couldn't help but respect that. It was a strange kind of partnership. But not everyone would see it that way. Back on Therax, news of Cale's newfound ship spread like wildfire. People who had once turned their backs on him were now whispering about the ex-human pilot who had somehow managed to fix an alien warship. There was a mix of awe, jealousy, and fear. Alien ships like Xylaris weren't just rare, they were dangerous. If anyone else found out how valuable this ship could be, Kale knew it wouldn't take long before bounty hunters, mercenaries, or worse, galactic authorities, would come knocking. One day, as he was making adjustments to the engine core, the voice spoke up again. "You should be careful," Xylaris warned. "There are others who would kill to get their hands on me. We both know you're not in a position to fight back." Kale stopped, his fingers hovering over the control panel. "You think I'm not prepared for trouble?" "I know you're not," Xylaris responded bluntly. "I'm not exactly a stealth ship, you know. We'll stick out like a sore thumb." "I've been hunted before," Kale said, his voice steady. "I can handle it." "Really?" the ship asked skeptically. "And what's your plan, exactly? Run for the hills with a giant, glowing alien vessel behind you?" "I'll figure something out," Kale said with a shrug. "You always do," Xylaris sighed, as if indulging him. "But don't say I didn't warn you. When the bounty hunters come, I'm not sticking my neck out for you." Kale chuckled, adjusting the ship's power systems. "Wouldn't expect you to." The words were a challenge, but also a promise. Kale had no intention of running from anyone, especially not when he had a ship like this, and as much as Xylaris didn't want to admit it, Kale could sense the subtle shift in their bond. It was more than just a human riding a machine now, it was a partnership, albeit a reluctant one. The next day, as Kale was calibrating the navigation systems, a strange signal appeared on his radar. "A ship. Coming fast. Too fast." "Xylaris," Kale said, his voice suddenly serious. "How fast can you go?" "You really want to test me now?" the voice retorted, but there was an edge of concern this time. "Fine. Hold on tight." Before Kale could respond, the ship lurched forward, its engines screaming as they pushed the limits of the hull. The world outside blurred into streaks of light as Kale fought to keep his grip on the controls. "Who the hell is that?" Kale muttered, staring at the incoming ship, a heavily armed freighter that was clearly targeting him. "Someone who has no business messing with us," Xylaris replied with a growl. "But they're about to learn the hard way." Kale's heart raced as the two ships closed in. The chase was on, and Kale had a sinking feeling that this wouldn't be the last time Xylaris would be forced to prove its worth. The voice in his head was no longer just a sarcastic commentator. It was something more, something that, if only Kale could admit it, was starting to feel a lot like a friend. But right now, all that mattered was survival, and Kale had a feeling that with Xylaris, he might just have a chance. End of Part 2. Part 3, The Chase. Kale's hands gripped the controls as the enemy freighter closed in on them. The massive ship, easily 5 times the size of Xylaris, was armed to the teeth with energy cannons and plasma turrets. The incoming transmission crackled through the comms, a gruff voice bellowing over the static. "This is the hailstorm," the voice growled. "You are in violation of galactic salvage protocols. Power down and prepare to be boarded, or we'll blast you out of the sky." Kale's eyes narrowed, and he could feel the adrenaline kick in. He'd been hunted before, but never like this, not by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. The hailstorm wasn't just some random thug. This was a ship meant for a fight. "You hearing this, Xylaris?" Kale said, his voice low but steady. "I hear it," the ship replied, an edge of annoyance in its tone. "And if you don't want to end up as space debris, you should probably start thinking about getting us out of here." "I've been thinking about that already," Kale replied, his fingers flying over the controls. He slammed the throttle forward, sending Xylaris into a sharp dive. The ship bucked beneath him as its organic systems seemed to shift and flex, like a creature suddenly aware of its predator. "I've never been chased before," Xylaris muttered, almost sounding intrigued. "Let's see how they handle this." The freighter fired first, a blast of energy that sizzled past them, narrowly missing. Kale grinned. The hailstorm might have the firepower, but it didn't have the maneuverability. "Not bad," Kale muttered. "Let's see how fast you can really move." He twisted the controls, sending the ship into a series of wild evasive maneuvers, sharp rolls, loops, and dives. Xylaris responded fluidly, shifting its shape like liquid metal, a perfect extension of Kale's will. The larger ship was slower, lumbering in comparison, unable to match their speed or agility. But it didn't give up easily. The hailstorm fired again, the blast grazing Xylaris' hull. The ship's systems hummed with distress, and a soft alarm beeped. That wasn't pleasant, Xylaris noted. You're going to pay for that, aren't you? Of course I am, Kale said, smirking. I've got a few tricks up my sleeve. He slammed a button on the control panel, activating the ship's cloaking system, an experimental feature Kale had been hesitant to test. The air around them shimmered as Xylaris seemed to fold into invisibility, the stars around them vanishing into the vast blackness of space. You think they'll fall for that? Xylaris asked. I don't know, Kale. You'll be surprised, Kale murmured, his eyes scanning the radar for any sign of the enemy ship. We just need to stay hidden long enough to get out of their range. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the soft hum of the ship's systems. The hailstorm fired off several more shots, but they passed harmlessly through empty space, too slow to track the now invisible ship. They're desperate, Xylaris noted, but they won't stop. They've already identified us, and I'm pretty sure they've got a few tricks of their own. I know, Kale replied, his brow furrowing. That freighter's too big to have just one weapon system. I'm guessing they've got a tracker on us. You're right, Xylaris confirmed, and if we're going to escape, we need to break that lock. Kale thought for a moment. Breaking the lock. That was it. His mind raced as he formulated a plan. He began rerouting power to the ship's secondary engines, boosting their output to full power. The cloaking system would only last for so long before the enemy picked up on the energy signature, so Kale had to act fast. All right, here's what we're going to do, Kale muttered. I'm going to break their lock with a sudden burst of speed. You're going to outrun them? Xylaris sounded dubious. Kale, we're in a scrap heap. They have more firepower, and you think you can just outspeed them? Trust me, Xylaris, this ship has more to it than you think. We can do this. The ship's systems whined in protest as Kale engaged the secondary engines, pushing the ship to its limits. They shot forward like a bolt of lightning, outpacing the hailstorm by far. But this wasn't just about speed, it was about breaking the lock. As they sped through a nearby asteroid field, Kale executed a sharp turn, sending Xylaris spiraling toward an asteroid at breakneck speed. He could hear the ship groaning under the strain, but he held his course. Now, Xylaris, now. Brace yourself, the ship warned, as the artificial gravity systems fluctuated. They shot past the asteroid, narrowly missing it. Just as Kale activated the ship's emergency EMP, a burst of electromagnetic energy shot out from the ship, a ripple of interference that fried any tracking systems in the vicinity. There was a moment of silence. Then, the comms crackled. Where the hell did they go? The voice from the hailstorm demanded, growing more frantic. Lock onto them now. Kale grinned. We're free. For now, Xylaris agreed, a hint of reluctant admiration in its tone. But they'll be back. And next time, they'll be ready for you. That's why I'm not sticking around, Kale said, already plotting a course out of the system. We're getting out of here, far away from Therax. Where exactly do you plan on going? Kale hesitated. He wasn't sure. He didn't have a solid plan, he never did. But he knew one thing, he couldn't stay in the scrap heaps forever. The galaxy was vast, and there were places out there where he could disappear, places where Xylaris and he could make a name for themselves. I'll figure it out, he said, pushing the throttle forward. We'll find a place, and when we do, we'll make sure nobody ever forgets our names. Good luck with that, Xylaris muttered. But hey, at least we'll have fun trying. As the stars streaked by, Kale knew one thing for certain, no matter what happened next, his days of being forgotten were over. With Xylaris by his side, he had a chance, and in this galaxy, that was all he needed. End of Part 3. Part 4, Into the Abyss. The silence of deep space was both a relief and a constant reminder of their precarious position. The hailstorm wasn't going to give up easily, and Kale had no illusions about how long they could hide from its pursuit. The freighter would be back. He had to move fast. But there was still one problem. Kale had no clear destination. Where are we heading, Kale? Xylaris' voice cut through the stillness, as if sensing his hesitation. Somewhere off the grid, Kale replied, his fingers flying across the control panel. A place where we can lay low for a while, get some time to figure things out. Oh, good. You're running again. The ship's tone was more amused than angry. I thought we were past this whole run away from problems thing. But fine. If it keeps me from being torn apart by bounty hunters, I'll humor you. Kale grinned, even though he knew the ship couldn't see it. It's not about running. It's about surviving. And the galaxy's full of places where no one's gonna ask questions. Xylaris murmured, almost to itself. You really do think we can just disappear, don't you? We can. But we need to stay ahead of the curve. No more messes. No more close calls. We find a place. We fix you up. And we figure out what to do next. The ship's systems hummed, as if considering this. I suppose that's the only option left for now. But remember, I'm not just a toy you can hide in a corner. I'm valuable. And people will come looking for me. I'm not worried about that right now, Kale said, eyes scanning the nearby stars. He had been in this position before, always running from something. But now, with Xylaris, it felt different. It wasn't just about running, it was about making a new start. He punched in the coordinates for an uncharted system, a remote, barely mapped star cluster known as the Abyss. It was a place where only the most daring or desperate went, a place beyond the reach of galactic law, where outcasts, smugglers, and lost ships made their homes. The Abyss? Xylaris' voice was skeptical. That's your idea of laying low? You realize it's called the Abyss for a reason, right? It's not exactly a vacation spot. I don't need a vacation, Kale replied. I need space. And the Abyss is as empty as it gets. Empty? That's what you think? I've spent some time near there before. It's a graveyard for ships and people. You won't be the only ones hiding there, asterisk. I've got nothing left to lose, Kale said with a half-smile, adjusting the ship's course. And neither do you. For a moment, there was silence, and Kale almost thought the ship had shut down entirely. Then Xylaris spoke again, its voice softer now, almost like a reluctant partner in a conspiracy. Fine, let's head to the Abyss. But if we get caught in a trap, don't say I didn't warn you. Kale nodded, more to himself than the ship. I wouldn't have it any other way. The Abyss was everything Kale had hoped for, and nothing like he expected. The star cluster was surrounded by dense fields of gas and asteroids, leaving the system almost invisible from any galactic scanners. As Kale and Xylaris passed through the outer rim, the sense of isolation hit him. This was a place for forgotten ships, abandoned cargo, and people who'd slipped through the cracks. A perfect place to disappear. As they entered the system, Kale saw the first sign of life, an old, battered station floating just ahead, surrounded by the remnants of ships long since abandoned. The station's exterior was patched together haphazardly, and its lights flickered like it might give out at any moment. But it was a safe haven, if only temporarily. This is it? Xylaris asked, clearly unimpressed. You brought me to a rusting junkyard in the middle of nowhere? It's temporary, Kale said, adjusting the ship's approach. We'll hide out here for a bit, get some repairs done. I'll figure out our next move after that. You'd better, the ship muttered. You can't expect me to stay here forever. I don't expect anything, Kale said with a chuckle. I just need a moment to breathe, a little peace and quiet. As they docked with the station, Kale couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't running from something, he was hiding out, regrouping, and, if things went right, he'd find a way to turn the tables. The station was alive with the hum of broken machinery, and the air smelled of recycled oxygen and spilled fuel. As Kale stepped off the ship, the clamor of voices hit him. Outcasts and smugglers filled the dimly lit halls, some eyeing him with suspicion, others with the same weariness that came from living on the fringes of society. Hey, you look lost, a voice called out from behind him. Kale turned, instinctively reaching for the blaster at his side, but stopped when he saw the speaker. A tall woman, with silver hair and an eye patch, leaned casually against a support beam. She was dressed in a mishmash of armor and civilian clothes, the kind of person who belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. Lost? Kale repeated, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, you don't exactly look like you belong here, or anywhere, really, she smiled, revealing a scar that ran across her cheek. Name's Vera. You planning on sticking around, or are you just passing through? Kale studied her for a moment, wary but intrigued. Passing through. Well, passing through doesn't get you much around here, Vera said with a shrug. This place is for people who have nowhere else to go. You look like you're running from something. Kale hesitated. He didn't want to reveal too much, not yet. But there was something about her that made him trust her. Just a little. She seemed like someone who understood what it meant to survive, no matter what. I guess you could say I'm running from myself, Kale replied, his voice low. Vera studied him for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, I know that feeling. You might be safer here, but don't expect to hide forever. The abyss has its own way of swallowing people whole. Kale exhaled slowly. He was beginning to realize just how much he had underestimated this place. The abyss wasn't just a refuge, it was a crucible, a place where the desperate came to disappear, and where only the strongest survived. I'm not planning on disappearing, Kale said. I'm planning on rebuilding. Good luck with that, Vera said, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. You'll need it. The abyss has a way of testing people. Then I guess I'll see if I'm up to the test. As Kale returned to Xylaris, the ship's voice greeted him, a mix of concern and curiosity. So? Looks like we're staying for a while, Kale said, settling into the cockpit. We need repairs, and I think it's time we figured out what we're really up against. The abyss isn't exactly the safest place to stay for long, Xylaris warned. You don't know who might be watching. I've never been afraid of trouble, Kale said, a determined glint in his eye. But I have a feeling we're not the only ones with something to hide. True, Xylaris agreed, but that doesn't mean we can't be the ones who control the game. And as Kale stared out into the endless expanse of space, he knew that this was only the beginning. The abyss was just the first step in a much bigger journey, and he wasn't running anymore. Not from his past, not from the galaxy, and certainly not from what was coming next. End of Part 4. Part 5, The Ties That Bind. The days blurred together as Kale settled into the rhythm of life on the station. The steady hum of Xylaris systems, the low chatter of the station's inhabitants, and the occasional screech of malfunctioning equipment became a backdrop for his existence. But the weight of the past and the constant pressure of staying one step ahead of those who might come looking for him never left his mind. As much as the abyss was a hiding place, it was also a reminder of how far he'd fallen. His former life as a decorated pilot, an elite fighter, seemed like a distant memory, a time when he still had purpose. Now, he was just another shadow in a forgotten corner of the galaxy. How long do you think we can keep this up? Xylaris' voice was laced with a kind of skepticism that Kale had come to recognize. We're already drawing attention. Someone's bound to figure out who we are sooner or later. Let them, Kale muttered, adjusting the ship's power core. We don't have the luxury of running forever. At some point, we'll have to take the fight back to them. That's a nice thought, the ship replied with a dry edge. But do you even know who they are yet? Or are you just making assumptions? Kale leaned back in the pilot's chair and looked out at the station through the cockpit windows. The station was a hodgepodge of derelict ships, abandoned containers, and makeshift homes patched together by scavengers. Some of the inhabitants were ex-soldiers, former smugglers, or outlaws who had found their place in the vast emptiness of the abyss. We'll figure it out, Kale said, trying to sound more certain than he felt. But the more we stay here, the more we'll learn. I'm not leaving until I have answers. Answers for what? Xylaris asked, a tone of curiosity creeping into its words. You're not going to suddenly get your old life back. You know that, right? Kale's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond immediately. The ship had a point. He couldn't go back. The war had taken everything, his comrades, his career, his sense of identity, and now it felt like he was running on fumes. Yet there was something within him, a spark of defiance, that refused to let it all go. Maybe he didn't know where he was going, but he had to believe there was a way to carve out a new future, one that didn't involve hiding. Later that day, Kale made his way through the station's narrow corridors, his boots echoing softly as he passed a handful of the station's residents. They glanced up at him briefly, some with curiosity, others with a mix of distrust and indifference. But Kale had grown used to that look. It was the same look he'd seen 100 times before in the darker corners of the galaxy. He found Vera in one of the station's common rooms, a place where traders and drifters met to exchange goods and information. She was sitting at a corner table, examining a small device, her eye patch gleaming under the flickering lights. Her presence was always a bit of a magnet for attention, but she had a way of commanding respect in this place, a confidence that came from having survived the worst the abyss had to offer. Kale slid into the seat across from her. I need to talk. Vera didn't look up from the device at first. You want to know how long you can stay here before someone comes knocking, huh? Kale nodded, not bothering to hide his frustration. I'm tired of running. I need answers. I can't keep hiding in the shadows. Vera finally looked up, her one good eye locking onto his with a sharp, almost predatory gaze. You're not the only one with something to hide. If you're looking for answers, you'll find them, but the truth isn't always what you want to hear. I'm not afraid of the truth, Kale said, his voice steady. She smirked. You should be. The abyss has a way of twisting everything. You might think you're running from your past, but out here, your past is going to catch up with you. Kale didn't respond immediately, his thoughts flickering back to the wreckage of his old life. His past had never really let him go, and Vera was right, he couldn't outrun it forever. What do you know about the people who might be hunting me? Kale asked. Vera set the device down, folding her arms as she leaned back in her chair. Oh, I know a few things. There's a lot of rumors floating around, but you're asking the wrong questions. You're assuming it's someone after you for what you did. But in the abyss, people don't care about your past. They care about what you've got, and what you're willing to trade. Kale frowned, not understanding. What do you mean? She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You think you're the only one who's been marked? There are people out there, Kale, who don't just want your ship, they want you. Or rather, they want what you used to be. He shook his head. What do you mean? You were a pilot, right? A good one, too, from what I've heard. Vera's lips curled into a smirk. People like that don't just disappear. They get repurposed, used. If I were you, I'd start thinking about why you're really being hunted. Kale's stomach churned. He hadn't considered the possibility that whoever was after him might have something else in mind. They weren't after him just for his ship, or his past. They wanted his skills. They wanted him. And that made him more dangerous than he'd ever realized. Great, Kale muttered, rubbing his face. So, I'm not just a fugitive, I'm a target. Vera gave him a sardonic smile. That's one way to put it. As Kale made his way back to Xylaris, his mind raced. There was so much he didn't know, so much that had been kept hidden from him. But now he had a clearer picture of what was at stake. The past wasn't just haunting him, it was being weaponized by someone else. He stepped into the cockpit, his gaze lingering on the control panel as he ran his fingers across the smooth, alien surface of the ship. Xylaris, despite all its quirks, had become more than just a machine. It was his only ally, a reluctant partner in this strange, dangerous new chapter of his life. What now? He murmured, more to himself than to the ship. Now, Xylaris responded. Now we stop running, and we start fighting back. Kale's heart quickened. There it was again, the same spark that had driven him before. The need to push forward, to reclaim something, even if he wasn't sure what. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was about proving that his past couldn't define him, that he could still be the one who called the shots. I'm listening, Kale said, leaning forward, his fingers resting lightly on the controls. We need to find out who's behind this, Xylaris replied, its tone resolute. But I'm not going in blind. First, we find the source. Then, we make them regret ever crossing us. Kale grinned, his pulse racing. Let's make it happen. As Xylaris powered up, ready for whatever was coming next, Kale knew one thing. This was far from over. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting for control, for his future. And he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. End of Part 5. Part 6, The Hidden Enemy. Kale's fingers flew over the controls, setting the ship on course for the next destination. The abyss wasn't just a hiding spot anymore, it was their starting point, a platform from which they would launch the next phase of their plan. But every move had to be calculated, every ally scrutinized. It wasn't just bounty hunters on their tail anymore. Someone far bigger and more dangerous, had marked him, and now Kale had no choice but to face them head-on. Xylaris, its voice low and serious, interrupted his thoughts. I've been running diagnostics on the systems. checking for any trace of outside interference. If they're tracking us, they've got some serious tech. Kale let out a breath. I'm guessing we're not talking about some simple bounty hunter with a grudge. Exactly, Xylaris replied, the ship's voice almost purring with the weight of its understanding. We're dealing with someone who has resources. The kind of resources that can erase people's histories and leave no trace. Whoever's behind this, they're not going to stop until they've either got you, or they've made you disappear for good. Kale clenched his jaw. He couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not after everything he'd lost. You're right, Kale muttered, eyes scanning the viewscreen. We need to start pulling at threads. Get to the heart of this before they can tighten their grip. Good luck with that, Xylaris said, a hint of cynicism still laced in its tone. But you know, I'm on board. I'll help. But don't expect me to be too patient. I'll keep that in mind, Kale muttered, his hands moving over the controls as he charted a course to one of the more dangerous sectors within the Abyss, a black market hub known for dealing in high-tech weaponry and, more importantly, information. The ship hummed beneath him, the familiar thrum of power resonating through the hull as they jumped into warp. Time seemed to stretch and contract as they slipped through the fabric of space, the stars warping around them. The station they arrived at was nothing like the broken, rusted docks of the previous location. This was sleek, cutting edge, and brimming with activity. It was known as the Forge, a hidden black market where illegal tech, information, and mercenaries were traded in the shadows. I don't like this place, Xylaris muttered. It's too clean, and too many people with too many guns. Relax, Kale said, checking his blaster and holster. We're just here for answers, not trouble. That's what everyone says until the bullets start flying. The ship quipped. I'd be more concerned if I were you. Kale shot the ship a wry smile. Thanks for the encouragement. As they docked, Kale knew they weren't going to blend in. The people here weren't just lawless outcasts, they were the type who dealt in high stakes and didn't hesitate to take what they needed by force. But Kale had done his fair share of walking through places like this. The key was always the same: keep your head down, make the right contacts, and never show fear. The market was alive with noise. Holographic advertisements flashed across walls, promising weapons that could slice through ships, cloaking tech that made entire fleets disappear, and artificial limbs that could turn an injured man into a weapon. Traders haggled in low voices while bounty hunters and smugglers stalked the aisles, sizing up every face they saw. Kale adjusted his jacket, keeping his posture casual, but his instincts were on high alert. He needed to find one man, someone who was known for having his ear to the ground in this part of the galaxy. As he walked through the market, a gruff voice called out, "Kale Drake, right?" He froze, his hand instinctively drifting toward his weapon, but the voice continued, calm and almost amused. "I've been expecting you." Kale turned to see a tall man with a scar running down the left side of his face, standing at the edge of one of the darker aisles. His clothes were dark, tactical, and a few weapons were holstered at his side, but there was something about the way he carried himself, no fear, no nervous energy, that made Kale uneasy. "Who the hell are you?" Kale demanded, his tone low but steady. The man grinned, stepping forward slowly. "My name's Drek, and you've been making quite a stir lately. Don't worry, though, I'm not here to collect your bounty, I'm here to offer you a deal." Kale's hand didn't leave his blaster, but he didn't make any sudden moves. "I'm not in the market for deals." "Funny," Drek replied, leaning against a nearby pillar. "Because I'm offering information. Information about the people hunting you." Kale stiffened, his pulse quickening. "Go on." Drek's grin widened. "The people chasing you? They're no ordinary bounty hunters. They're part of a faction within the Outer Coalition, one that's very interested in your past. Kale, they know what you did, they know what you can do, and now they want you for something bigger." Kale's eyes narrowed. He'd heard whispers about the Outer Coalition, a powerful, shadowy conglomerate with fingers in nearly every corner of the galaxy. But to be a target of theirs? That was something he hadn't prepared for. "Why me?" Kale demanded. "I'm just some washed-up ex-pilot. Why would they care?" Drek's smile faded slightly, replaced by something colder. "They don't want you alive, Kale. They want what you know. You were part of something. Something they're still hunting down. Something they'll do anything to control." Kale's mind raced, but before he could speak, Drek held up a hand. Don't get ahead of yourself. I'm not here to sell you a story, but I can tell you where you'll find the answers. There's a facility out on the edge of the abyss, a place where they run tests on people like you. You'll find what they want there. Kale's jaw clenched. Tests? What had they done to him? And what did they want to use him for? And what's the catch? Kale asked. Drek's grin returned, but it wasn't friendly. The catch? You go in alone. You get what you need, and then, we both get what we want. Kale didn't hesitate. He didn't have time to consider the risks. The answers he needed were waiting for him, and if Drek's information was accurate, they would lead him to the heart of whatever dark project had branded him a target. You've got yourself a deal, Kale said, his voice steady. Drek's eyes gleamed. Good. I'll send you the coordinates, but I wouldn't wait too long. The coalition doesn't like their secrets getting out. As the man disappeared into the crowd, Kale felt the weight of the decision settle in. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be safe, but it was his only option. Ready when you are, Kale said, turning toward Xylaris. The ship's voice rang in his ears almost immediately. Well, looks like we're taking the fight to them. Then, I'm in. Kale's lips curled into a wry smile. Let's make sure they regret it. End of part 6.